All right, so today we're going to take a look at this kind of unsettling idea
Yeah.
that's been floating around about a grand plan for the West Bank.
Mhm.
It involves Israel, obviously, and the creation of something they're calling 7 Emirates. And I mean, it just sounds like a movie title or something, right?
Ultimately.
But we're here to kind of cut through that noise and,
Yeah.
look at what's actually in the source material here.
Absolutely.
So we're
Yeah.
diving deep into a couple things today.
Yeah.
We've got a YouTube transcript of Vustu. It features a Palestinian political analyst named Samed Dwekat.
Okay.
And then we've also got this fascinating article by Dr. Ahmed Abu Al-Hajjah.
Right.
And he kind of lays out this potential Jenin model.
Yeah.
And also brings up this idea of 7 Emirates in the West Bank.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting.
So we're going to try to synthesize all that.
Yeah.
So our listeners, you're probably following all this pretty closely, but we're going to make this really easy to understand.
Yes.
So this is, you're involved in the region professionally. Maybe you're just a news junkie and you're trying to follow what's happening in geopolitics, or maybe you just want to figure this stuff out. We're going to give you a good overview today.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at this grand plan.
Right.
And kind of break it down.
Mm-hmm.
What are the elements that they're talking about in these sources?
Mm-hmm.
And then what are the perspectives of these analysts?
Yeah.
And try to tease out the implications without going into any kind of our own opinions about it.
Yeah.
Because it's sensitive stuff.
Of course.
And we just want to report what these guys are saying.
Absolutely. So this idea of a grand plan, I mean, you've probably heard this.
Right.
Israel's going to, reorganize the West Bank into these 7 Emirates. It just, it almost sounds too wild to be true.
It's like out of a movie.
But so what's actually going on here?
So Dr. Abu Al-Hajjah's article,
okay,
he talks about this concept of a second model for the West Bank.
Mm-hmm.
And he's suggesting that it's even more dangerous than something that came before called the Jenin Model.
Right. So this isn't totally new. It's building on stuff that's already happened.
Exactly.
And neither of these sources really give us like a detailed map or a breakdown of these 7 Emirates, like where the boundaries are, what powers they would have.
Yeah.
But they are pointing to some kind of big reorganization within the West Bank.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess we got to go back in time a little bit to this first Jenin model.
Yeah, let's unpack that.
That happened back in 2010.
Okay.
So this wasn't just some idea. This actually happened.
It was a real thing.
Yeah. So we had the governor of Jenin, Kadura Musa, working with Dani Attar, who was the head of the Gilboa Settlements Council.
Wow.
And this whole thing was supervised by Tony Blair, who was the quartet representative at the time.
Huh. That's interesting.
It's pretty crazy when you think about
get
different sides.
Yeah, strange mix.
Coming together.
Yeah.
So the goal here was basically, Jenin had been this center of resistance, especially during the Second Intifada.
Right.
And the battle there in 2002, Israel saw it as a huge security threat.
I see.
I mean, they called it a viper's nest, which kind of tells you something.
Yeah.
So they wanted to change that.
Okay.
They wanted to have the Palestinian Authority cooperating on security.
So much more cooperation.
Yeah. And for the Palestinians, it wasn't all about security.
Right.
The idea was that if they cooperated on security, it would lead to economic prosperity. In Jenin.
Right.
It was part of this bigger Israeli economic peace plan.
Interesting.
So it's kind of like a trade security for development.
Yeah, a quid pro quo.
Exactly. And for a while it seemed to work.
It did, yeah.
Dr. Abu Al-Hajjah says that Jenin was actually the quietest city in the West Bank for about 10 years.
Really?
And they opened the Jalama crossing, which helped the economy.
Okay.
And there were even reports of Israeli security personnel feeling safe in Jenin because the Palestinian Authority was cooperating so much.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, it is a big change.
Yeah.
They even tried to expand this model to Nablus, which is another big city in the West Bank. So they must have thought it was working pretty well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it even kind of kept going during that unrest in Jerusalem in 2015.
Oh, interesting.
So it wasn't just some superficial thing.
Right.
But as both of our sources say, this first Jenin model it eventually fell apart.
It did.
The Sword of Jerusalem conflict in 2021 seems to have been a turning point.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the escalation between Gaza and Israel kind of showed that these local agreements can be pretty fragile.
That makes sense.
When you've got these bigger political issues going on.
Yeah.
And after that, we saw this new generation of resistance emerging in the West Bank, in Jenin as well.
Okay.
And Samed Dwekat says that things got even worse. The security coordination completely broke down after October 7th. So that brings us up to the second Jenin model.
Okay, so the interview in Oshu and Dr. Abu Al-Hajjah, they both talk about this second model.
Right.
And they even mention discussions happening on Israeli media, like Channel 14.
Right.
And the argument they're making is that what Israel is doing in Jenin isn't just about, going after specific threats.
Right.
It's something bigger.
Yeah. So in the Usha interview, they're saying that Israel's using Jenin to test a whole new way of governing the West Bank.
Wow.
And that they're going to implement it gradually by the end of this year and then expand it to other Palestinian cities.
That's a big...
I mean, that's a huge claim.
Yeah.
You got to look at that carefully.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what's the goal here?
So according to the analysis, the goal is to re-engineer the relationship with the Palestinian security forces.
Okay.
They want them to not only anticipate Israeli security needs, but to actually act in line with Israeli objectives.
Wow.
It's a much deeper level of control.
Yeah, that's way beyond just cooperation.
Right.
And you can't forget about the leverage that Israel has.
Right.
They're withholding those clearance funds.
Yeah, those are tax revenues.
Right. The tax revenues that Israel collects on behalf of the PA, which is a huge part of their budget.
Huge part.
So they're really pressuring the PA at what they're calling this historic decision phase.
Wow.
For the West Bank.
So they're trying to really force their hand in this new model.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So why Jenin?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Dr. Abu Al-Hajjah brings up a good point. Of course, it's a security challenge.
Right, the refugee camp.
Right, the refugee camp. But he doesn't think that's the main reason.
No.
He says Jenin is different from a lot of other West Bank cities because it's not right next to any Israeli settlements.
Oh, interesting.
So it's less risky for Israel to try out this new approach. It's like a contained area where they can manage the reactions more easily.
Right, like a controlled experiment.
Exactly.
Interesting.
So let's look at what this re-engineering actually means on the ground. It's pretty radical.
It does.
So they're talking about dismantling the whole physical structure of the Jenin refugee camp. Like, they're going to demolish buildings in phases and then rebuild based on a new urban plan. Wider streets, modern infrastructure, a layout that's more like a regular city.
Like a regular neighborhood.
Yeah.
Wow.
But here's the really troubling part. Dr. Abu Al-Hajjah says that under this new plan, only about half of the current residents of the Jenin refugee camp would be allowed to return.
So they're going to displace people.
Yeah, potentially a lot of people.
That raises a lot of questions.
It does, about displacement, about the right of return for refugees.
Right.
Which Samed Dwekat also talks about in that Who's Show interview. So this brings us to the bigger picture.
Yeah, what's the overall objective here?
Yeah, what are the Israelis really trying to do? So Samed Dwekat says that this is part of a larger right-wing project in Israel. And it's driven by expansionist dreams. He points to figures like Avi Dichter,
who've talked about a second Nakba.
Wow.
Which is basically a repeat of the 1948 displacement.
That's pretty frightening.
It is, and it's happening in the context of all these other things.
Right.
Dwekat says there's this belief in Israeli policy circles that Palestinians will always resist.
Regardless.
Yeah, no matter what.
No matter what.
So they have to constantly try to undermine that will to resist.
Right.
And then there's the settler population.
Yeah.
It's grown so much.
It's huge now.
Yeah, it's over 500,000 people now.
Wow.
Compared to a pretty small number back in the day.
Right.
And Dwekat thinks that this demographic shift is giving Israel new ideas about how to control the region and redraw the borders to accommodate all these settlers.
Yeah.
And he also points out that the Arab world is pretty unstable right now.
Yeah.
A lot of internal problems. So he thinks some people in Israel see this as a chance.
Oh, I see.
To get away with more.
To make their move.
Exactly.
Oh.
And then there's the settlement construction,
Right.
It's been going on at a crazy pace since 1967.
Unprecedented.
Yeah. And the influence of religious Zionism is growing.
In the army.
Yeah, in the army, in the government.
Right.
And Dwekat thinks all of this is pushing the West Bank towards annexation.
De facto annexation.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then you've got the whole issue of the right of return for refugees. Dwekat says it's totally tied up with this re-engineering of the refugee camps.
Okay.
He thinks that by changing the camps physically and demographically, Israel's trying to undermine the whole idea of the right of return.
Interesting.
He also talks about how Israel is dealing with Hamas.
Okay.
They're trying to weaken Hamas by taking away their leverage, like the issue of prisoners. And they want to put off any real political negotiations.
Hoping that the humanitarian crisis in Gaza will put enough pressure on Hamas
to give in?
Yeah. And ultimately, they want to eliminate the whole idea of resistance.
Wow.
So Dwekat's really saying that this second Nakba is a real goal for some people in Israel.
Frightening.
Yeah. And he's worried about the influence of the military. He says it's becoming more ideological and might not care so much about international borders anymore.
They have their own vision.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And he sees settlement expansion as a security strategy.
Okay.
They believe that more settlements equal more security.
Right.
He points out that there are tons of new outposts popping up.
Especially those agricultural ones.
Yeah, especially those agricultural ones. And figures like Bezalel Smotrich are really integrating them into the state.
Giving them state services.
Exactly.
Right.
And then there are these huge settlement blocks that are basically dividing the West Bank. Yeah, into cantons.
Yeah, into cantons, separating the Palestinians and creating these demographic barriers. And then there's Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Dwekat talks about how they're trying to Judaize Jerusalem. They want to annex the settlements around it and maybe even remove some Palestinian neighborhoods that are outside the separation barrier.
To change the demographics.
Yeah, they want a Jewish majority.
Right.
And don't forget the economic incentives.
Right.
Dwekat says a lot of settlers are attracted by the money. The government gives them all kinds of benefits and subsidies to move there.
It's a huge draw.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then there's the rise of the right wing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just in society. It's in the government, too.
Right.
You've got these prominent settler leaders who are now ministers.
With real power.
Yeah. With real power over the West Bank.
Scary.
And they're arming the settlers. Ben-Gvir is trying to create a whole new security force, right, just for settlers.
Yeah, just for settlers.
Wow.
And we're seeing more and more settler violence against Palestinians. So things are getting more confrontational.
Yeah, it feels like a turning point.
Yeah, it does. Dwekat also talks about the restrictions on Palestinian construction in Area C, which is most of the West Bank, and even in parts of Area B.
And that's because...
Yeah, and they say it's because the Palestinians don't have the right building permits.
Right. Or approved plans.
Right, or the settlements nearby are expanding their influence. So they're demolishing Palestinian homes and making it really hard for them to live there.
Right.
And then he brings up this old plan called the Allon Plan from 1967. It was this idea that Israel would control the most important parts of the West Bank, like the Jordan Valley and Jerusalem, but the Palestinians would have some
autonomy.
You know, some local autonomy and maybe some connection to Jordan.
Interesting.
And Dwekat thinks that with all of the settlements, in the current situation in the region, a new version of this plan might be gaining traction. And finally, he points out that there's no one in the region who can really stop Israel from doing what it wants in the West Bank.
There's no counterweight.
Yeah, there's no real counterweight.
Wow.
So that's a lot.
It is a lot.
I mean, it's a pretty grim picture.
Yeah.
But let's go back to those 7 Emirates.
Okay.
We've talked about all these bigger trends and objectives, but how does this idea actually fit in?
Yeah, what does it mean?
So our sources give us a lot of detail about the overall strategy and what's happening in Jenin.
Right.
But they're not very specific.
About the Emirates.
Yeah, about the 7 Emirates, Dr. Abu Al-Hajjah and Samed Dwekat don't really tell us exactly what they would look like.
Like the boundaries.
Yeah, the boundaries, the powers, any of that.
Right.
But based on everything else we've talked about, the Palestinian areas are becoming more fragmented because of the settlement.
The settlement expansion.
Yeah. And this second Jenin model is all about localized governance. And then there's this possibility of a new Allon Plan. So maybe the 7 Emirates are like these separated Palestinian areas with some local autonomy, but ultimately under Israeli control.
Ultimately controlled by Israel.
Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense.
So it fits with this bigger trend of Israel taking more control and the Palestinian Authority getting weaker.
Yeah.
And it would mean that the Palestinians are divided.
Divided and isolated.
Yeah.
Wow.
But we have to be careful.
That's right.
Our sources don't give us enough information to say for sure what the 7 Emirates would be.
We're speculating based on the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we've covered a lot today.
We have.
This is complicated stuff.
It is.
But what are the key takeaways?
Yeah. So first, it's pretty clear that Israel is trying to reshape the West Bank, and they're using Jenin as a testing ground. For how to control and govern things.
And it's not just about security.
Yeah.
They're also changing the demographics and geography. I mean, look at what they're doing to the refugee camps.
Yeah.
It's pretty drastic.
It is.
And the settlements are a huge part of this.
They're driving it.
Yeah, they're driving it. And the settler leaders are in power now.
With a lot of influence.
Yeah, so they can really push their agenda.
It's scary.
It is.
And the Palestinian Authority. They're under so much pressure. They have to cooperate with Israel on security. But they also have to take care of their people.
Yeah, and Israel is making it even harder. By withholding those funds.
It's a tough spot to be in.
Yeah.
And then there's the regional context. The Arab states are weak.
They've got their own problems. So Israel might feel like it can get away with more.
That's a dangerous situation.
It is.
Yeah.
So that leaves us with a really important question.
What's that?
How is all of this going to affect the Palestinians?
Yeah, in the long term.
Yeah, in the long term.
How are they going to live?
Yeah, how are they going to live? What's going to happen to their society? What about their hopes for the future? And what can the international community actually do? I mean, things are changing so fast.
Yeah, the power dynamics are shifting.
Exactly.
So this is something for everyone to think about.
It is, and it's important to keep learning.
Yes,
absolutely. Read from different sources.
Different perspectives.
Yeah, different perspectives, and stay engaged.
Stay informed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was a good one.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.